we may have been fairly quiet. There has been quite a lot going on in the background. There will then be a premiere of the Watlington Hedgerow project film, which Nicola has made, which is about 15 minutes long. And after that, there'll be a chance to ask Nigel, our international hedgerow expert who lives in the parish, to ask him questions about the film and also hedgerows in general. We will then have some discussion groups, and also there'll be some information about the next Watlington Climate Action Group event, which is the regarding offshore wind power, which I think Andrea can give us a little update on that. And we hope to finish the meeting at about 9:30. The discussion groups, we thought it'd be useful to let you all know what they're going to be now. And then if you can message in the chat box, Satnam, he can then, and tell him which group you think you'd like to be in, he can then allocate you all to the relevant groups. We hope that the technology will work. So there'll be one session on wildlife gardening, which will be led by Ian Naismith, who he and his daughter have been writing a great series of articles about wildlife gardening in the Watlington Times, and it would be good to have some feedback on that and to discuss ways that we can support more wildlife friendly gardening. I will discuss a session on the community, on the idea of developing a community orchard, where of course there are lots of developments happening around Watlington, and we're very keen to ensure that we do all we can to make sure that the effects on biodiversity from those new developments are reduced, and indeed that if possible, there's a net gain for biodiversity. So anyone who's interested in that and contributing to that debate can join that group with Andrea. And finally, there'll be a discussion about how we can increase awareness of the Green Plan and involve more people, and that will be led by Nicola. So now I'm going to hand over to Nicola, and she will recap on the event that was held last March.
Thank you, Fiona. So I'd like to take you back in time. I'd actually like to take you back in time, not just to last March, but all the way back to March 2019, when some of you may remember or may have gone to the Watlington Parish Council brainstorming session that was held to generate ideas to see what we could do to tackle the climate action group. And there was also a lot of ideas that were also generated around the same time in our newly established Watlington Climate Action Group Facebook group. There was over 200 ideas altogether, and tree planting was one of those ideas. We then held 2 more public meetings to prioritise those ideas on the basis of the ease of implementation and the impact they would have. And tree planting made it through that process onto our priority list. But very quickly, it became apparent that tree planting is not as straightforward or as simple as it sounds, especially around Watlington, where we've got a number of sensitive habitats. And we also found out that tree planting isn't necessarily the best way to sequester carbon, and that grasslands and other habitats are also good carbon sinks themselves. We spoke to Watlington Environment Group and others, and became increasingly aware of the importance of also protecting biodiversity as part of ensuring that we have an ecosystem that's resilient to climate change and on which we can depend. So those 2 objectives, carbon sequestration and biodiversity, form the key objectives of this project, which grew legs and became known as the Green Plan. So in order to get us up to speed and increase our knowledge quickly on a range of local habitats, we invited 5 specialists, each of whom could have talked for an entire evening on their habitat, and we gave them each 10 minutes. So I will now attempt to summarise some of those presentations the key points that we got out of that, just to remind you of what we discussed. And I do apologise in advance for some of the speakers that are here tonight if I mangle their words, which are obviously much better in the original. If you want to see the whole presentation, it is on our website, on the Watlington Climate Action Group website homepage, so you can go and revisit those presentations in full. So the first person to speak was actually Robert Barber of Watlington Environment Group, and he gave us an overview of the different habitats that we have. And then we had Matt Bond, who's the National Trust Ranger, and he talked about the grasslands, the very special grasslands that we have around Watlington. So grassland, although, I mean, I didn't know this before we started looking at this, but I was surprised to find that grassland is actually the highest carbon stock of any UK habitat. There's nothing above ground, but it's all storing the carbon underground. And high diversity grasslands up to 500% better at storing carbon. Matt explained that they were resilient to climate change because they're naturally dry environments. Anyway, and what we have here around Watlington is some of the most floristically diverse grassland in the Chilterns. You can see a picture of Watlington Hill there. From that, you can see that what we have here is a mosaic habitat. So we have hedgerows, we have areas of grassland, we have low scrub, and we have woodland. And that mosaic habitat is so important for wildlife and biodiversity. Then Ian talked about the ponds and watercourses projects that are WEG are running, and explained that the chalk streams that we have here are globally rare habitats, so really important for biodiversity. He talked about ponds and the importance that they have for amphibians, and that they can act as carbon sink if the sediments are allowed to develop. Garden ponds also are very important as carbon sinks, as they don't dry out. So ponds take in carbon, but when they dry out, they then release that carbon back to the atmosphere. There's a couple of interesting projects that support these aims. One was a biodiversity corridor along Purton Brook, and the other key thing was working with developers to create additional ponds. Then we had Stuart Mabbott, and he was talking about wildlife gardens, and gardens are one of the main habitats that we have here in Watlington, and one we can have direct control over as individuals, so they're quite unique in that respect. Stuart explained that it's not necessarily a lot of extra work to create a mini nature reserve from your garden. It does involve some work, but it's not a huge amount. He talked about how in November we can leave the stalks of perennial plants, and they provide a habitat for hibernation for insects that then will then go on to be predators for pests and reduce the need for other pesticides. You don't need to pick up all the apples from the ground under your apple tree. You can leave some to rot and attract butterflies. He talked about the importance of planting a diversity of different plants, keeping grass in different lengths, and having ponds and deadwood in the garden being important. And I talked to linking to other gardens through hedges, and whether we could look and see if we could do something different but complementary to your neighbours. So if your neighbours have got trees, then you can be the grassy woodland glade, or if they've got grass, then you can plant trees and be the woodland area to help create a landscape that is more like the one that you might find in nature. So he really challenged us to think about, can you make a difference? Can we make a difference in our own gardens? I don't want to forget Nigel here. Nigel also obviously spoke, but since we've got a whole film on hedgerows, I'm not going to repeat his points from his presentation. And then we had Martin, who was talking about the trees. And again, interestingly, it's not so much the trees that hold the carbon, although of course they do. It's also the ground conditions and the soil beneath the trees that are carbon. Difficult to say how much carbon that a woodland or trees take, because it really depends on the species that is used and what the timber is used for. So that affects the potential for carbon storage. Now, there's a huge amount of talk in the media about tree planting. It's very much in vogue, but we need to, one of Martin's key points is that we need to make sure that the longevity of the trees is secured in order to realise that benefit. And that really means that you need to have a plan, especially a plan for the maintenance and the ongoing maintenance of the trees. Having clear objectives being really important, and planting the right species in the right place. And the other point that I took from his presentation was that diversity is the key to resilience. After the speakers, we had 5 breakout groups to think about. So each of those groups was led by one of the experts, and to think about what people had heard in that presentation, how that could be possibly applied in Watlington to create projects that would help us meet the challenges of climate change. And I think that's my bit in terms of what happened at that meeting. And I think then we hand over to Fiona to talk about what happened next.
Thank you, Nicola. I'd just like to say, you know, that the level of enthusiasm and interest in the room at that meeting was wonderful, and that following it, the number of people came forward and said they wanted to be involved in putting something together for Watlington, which we've decided to call a green plan. And one of the great things that we've really welcomed is the opportunity to work with people from other groups, particularly Watlington Environment Group. It's been great working in partnership with them, and to welcome other volunteers getting involved. And we're still looking for volunteers to get involved, of course, and you know, the commitment that you give is completely up to you, how much you get involved. If we could move on to the next slide, and I'll just talk about, give you a little bit more information about what we're trying to do with the Green Plan. So these are broadly our aims. As Nicola's already said, it's about protecting and enhancing biodiversity within the whole of the parish of Watlington, and helping to tackle climate change through carbon sequestration. But on top of that, we also want to improve the resilience, connectivity and management of local habitats. Connectivity is vital. You know, if you have an isolated habitat with not connected to anything else, that's not good. You want all of the natural habitats to be as connected as possible, and which is of course where hedgerows can play a very important role, as will become clear later. We also feel it's important that we have good access to our local green spaces. And particularly at the moment, I'm sure any of you who walk will, I mean, there's so many people out enjoying our local green spaces at the moment, which is great, but we need to be sure people are using them in the right way. And we want to communicate with the local community to increase awareness and understanding of biodiversity and natural carbon solutions. So that's broadly our aims, and we've got a number of sort of areas that we're working in and taking forward, and I'll just quickly summarise some of those. Before we do anything, we sort of need to know what we've got. What do we have in Watlington in the way of natural habitats, green spaces, etc. We've been very lucky to have Charlotte Moss, who lives here in Watlington, involved, as she is a real whiz at mapping, and also to have advice from Roselle Chapman, who lives nearby and is community ecologist with Wild Oxfordshire, and her role is to support groups such as ours at providing information and help and advice. And so between them, they've been a great help in helping us to map what we've already got in Watlington. And we had an interesting meeting last night where there's an Oxfordshire-wide project called the Woodland Opportunity Mapping Project, I think that's what it's called, where they're looking at the whole county and where there are opportunities to plant trees. And they've decided to use Watlington as a test case, which is excellent. So they had produced maps for Watlington, and luckily it very much backs up with what we're already coming up, the ideas we're coming up with. So if we can move on to the next one, that would be great. we identified wildlife gardening as something that would be very good to pursue. As Nicola's already said, within the town itself, obviously most of the green spaces are gardens, and the potential of those gardens to provide wildlife habitats is enormous. And so that's been being taken forward largely by Ian Naismith and his daughter through the articles I've already mentioned. But we want to explore other ways that we can support gardeners by providing information and advice. We could move on to the next one. We're also hoping to look at road verges. Now, road verges can provide incredibly valuable wildlife habitats. You know, they're not really disturbed by people. Of course, there's the cars rushing by, but they can be very, very rich wildlife habitats with a good variety of plants, which will then attract invertebrates and birds and small mammals. And we do have some very interesting road verges within the parish. So we'd like to know more about what the road verges, what the value of the road verges, and then we need to think about how they can be better managed for those species, to encourage the species. And we're delighted that the parish council, for the rather limited number of road verges that it is responsible for managing, because most of them are the responsibility of the county council, but the parish council has agreed to cut those verges fewer times in the year, which will allow the wildflowers to flourish. So if we can move on to the next one. Of course, we're all aware there's quite a lot of development going to happen around Watlington. Watlington is going to be very different in the future. And I think we need to have an input to ensure that all of these developments will result in a net gain for biodiversity. It's the jargon. And indeed, when the Environment Bill is finally finalised and approved by government, I think it's every development has to result in a 10% net gain for biodiversity. So we just need to work with developers and make sure that this is planned from an early stage, and opportunities are created for tree planting, planting native hedges, putting up swift boxes, encouraging hedgehogs to move between gardens, etc., etc. And so we are already working in this way. We had a meeting, a group of us with Jill Bindoff had a meeting with the ecologist for the Blorholm site earlier this week. And the Green Plan has just about now produced a position statement regarding development, but we would very much appreciate any support for this area of work. And a key thing is going to be monitoring that the developers really do the work that they said they were going to do, and that it's going to be suitably managed into the future. The other project is the Hedgerow project, but I'm not going to talk about that now. I'm going to hand over to Nicola. Just a map here to show that, as I mentioned earlier, hedgerows are very important for connectivity between habitats. And I'd like to hand over to Nicola now, who will introduce the film, which will tell us more about this project, which we're very excited about.
Thank you for that. Fiona. Yeah, we made a film. I just a quick few thank yous. I'd like to thank the Watlington Parish Council for supporting this, and I'd also like to thank Nigel, Fiona, Robert, Charlotte and Helen for all agreeing to be in it, and to all the Hedgerow project volunteers for tolerating me following them around with the camera. I hope you find it interesting. Nigel and the team will be available for questions both on the film and then also on any of the other projects afterwards. If you like the film, it would be really brilliant if you could share it to anyone who you think might be interested. We'd really like to get people in Watlington to know about this project. So I will send a link. I'm going to send a link in the text so if you can, I need to send you that now. Hang on. Okay, so in the chat, you should see there's a link to the film, we thought the easiest if you click on that film and watch it. It takes 15 minutes to watch the whole film, and then come back when you've watched it, and we'll have a Q&A.
We know we have to take action on climate change.
We know that species are becoming extinct at an unprecedented rate.
Biodiversity is important for its own sake, but more than that, our whole food and planetary system depends on it.
One of the issues that we face here in Watlington is that we're surrounded by many sensitive and interesting habitats.
And the land is already under competing pressure.
So what can we do that will sequester carbon, that will protect biodiversity, and critically won't require additional land?
One of the options we looked at for action is hedges.
There's been a huge amount of talk of planting trees in order to sequester carbon, but not much talk about hedgerows. Yet hedgerows are an excellent way to sequester carbon because effectively a hedgerow is a line of trees.
And we're lucky in having Nigel Adams, an international expert on hedgerows, living within the parish, so we asked him to help.
I think hedges are so important in our landscape because they actually define our landscape. I can't imagine our country having no hedgerows. It would be impossible.
Hedgerows are effectively a tiny replication of the much more wooded landscape we used to enjoy, with all the biodiversity and climatary benefits that had to offer.
Hedgerows provide us as humans with many different things. We call those things services. We call them environmental services. And actually of any habitat in the country, be it mountain moorland or heathland or estuary, hedgerows, the simple basic hedgerow, provides us with more ecosystem services than any other habitat. It's quite incredible. So they protect soils from wind erosion. They can prevent flooding in two ways. They stop floodwaters rising, but they can also percolate heavy rains down through the ground because of their roots. They provide important habitat for wildlife species, and actually very rare wildlife species in many cases.
If you've got an isolated bit of wood here and an isolated bit of wood here, hedgerows are very important in connecting those two and bring huge benefits for biodiversity, which in itself is helping us to find climate solutions.
We're rapidly learning that hedgerows are very important in our fight against climate change. They actually take in carbon, they store carbon in two different ways really. So if you look at this hedge here, it's storing carbon in its woody structure. Wood is literally made up partly of carbon, but it's also taking carbon down into the ground and through the roots is actually storing it in the ground. Now as long as that ground's not disturbed, the carbon is not released. So beneath the hedgerow, it's undisturbed ground. The carbon is stored there. If we look at the margin next to a hedge, that ground is undisturbed. So the combination of the undisturbed ground, the carbon storage in the roots and in the ground and in the woody structure really does help to soak in carbon. Hedgerows can only really do that effectively if they're healthy. And that's one of the reasons, I think, in Watlington Parish, why we want to find out the condition of our hedges. Are they healthy? How can we help them to be more healthy and therefore store more carbon? So it's the middle of October and we have actually started our project. We asked for volunteers and we've got a very keen set of volunteers.
They're really quite a diverse group with all sorts of experience and background, and existing knowledge of hedgerows was not necessary.
First thing we've got to do with them is to actually give them a bit of hedgerow training, I suppose. So we've had a few days of training. We're going to teach them the methodology of how to measure the hedgerow's width and height and the condition, etc. We've done some ID, basically looking at the leaf shape, but also the fruit and all those little signals that can tell us about the ID, and helping them learn about the People's Trust for Endangered Species survey, how to fill it out. And then we're going to go out and we're going to be measuring the hedges, looking at the hedges, height, width, condition, as I say. And this is going to help us, as we move forward, know what condition our hedges are in. Are they healthy? It's all about gaining information at the moment, and it's a really fun project to do with volunteers.
I really wanted to get involved with this project because it's a nice community project. It helps me to understand and look more carefully at the countryside around me, and I'm often out walking, but this means I'm looking more carefully at things and a chance to give something back, really.
First thing we wanted to know was, where are the hedges? How many have we got? And we're very, very lucky to have Charlotte Moss on our team. She's an expert on mapping, so that's a great advantage.
The first thing when you're going out to do a survey is to understand the area you're surveying. So as a first step, looked at a load of maps of the area and compiled them. So the data is generally from the OS, but I've also used some LiDAR data, which has allowed me to look at the areas that are very vegetated. And from that, I've been able to estimate whether I think a boundary between, say, a field and a road, or between two fields, whether it's a fence, or whether it's a hedge, or whether it's actually a line of trees. And so I've been able to categorise that, and then that will form the basis that we can go out and use when we're actually going to survey the hedges, so people know where to go as a first step. And it's also been quite useful, just quick exercise to work out actually how many kilometres of hedge we have in the Watlington parish, and at the moment the estimate is 45 kilometres.
So we're able to map the hedges, we need to go out and ground truth them, and then with the permission of the landowners we can go on and carry out our surveys. And we're particularly thankful to the landowners for allowing us on their land to do the surveys, and hopefully they gain a lot from it as well, because we are actually able at the end to give them some management suggestions for the hedges.
To me, a good hedge will be thick and tall, although that will vary depending on its state of management. Will have foliage to the ground, will be continuous without gaps, ideally punctuated by hedgerow trees, and contain a good range of species. In addition, it will ideally have margins uncultivated on both sides.
So I think we can make two predictions about the hedges in Watlington, and that is that they're going to be one of two types. One is going to be a hawthorn hedge, single species hawthorn hedge that were planted at the time of the enclosures. Previously around Watlington it would have been open field system with hardly any hedges at all. And then secondly, often at the top of the hill there will be more ancient species, and there'll be species-rich hedges. There'll be a variety of species in the hedge. Two different types of hedge. With the hawthorn hedge, I'm slightly worried that we're going to find really, really over-trimmed hedges that have been cut to the same height since possibly the 1950s, and they're starting to get very, very gappy at the base. Here's a gap. This would have been full of hawthorn once. I know it would have been a full hedge because I can see signs of old laying many, many years ago, probably from the 1940s. So this would have been a thick hedge once, but now the gaps are starting to arrive. Here, this is one tree. It's about 6 metres wide. The stem is about a good foot in diameter. So it's starting to look like a table. It's starting to look like a mushroom. There's nothing underneath. There's no nesting space. There's no protection from the wind or anything coming through the bottom of here. And this hedge is slowly and surely disappearing. In fact, as we come down here, this is a dead one here. I can break that off. And this here, this is dead. And the rest of it is nothing. This hedge is imperceptibly disappearing through over-trimming. Those very same hedges could be at the other extreme, and they could have been neglected now for the last 50 years. And they will be very, very tall hawthorn trees along the hedge line, which are now starting to die. They've almost gone through their natural life process. On the species-rich hedges, they seem to withstand hedge trimming a lot better, I must say, but it still is a problem. Over-trimming is a problem. This hedge, we're in the middle of October, has just been trimmed. As we see the machines coming down here, it's quite splattered in places. It's just been trimmed. All the berries that were on here 2 weeks ago have now gone, and as the machine comes right down here, no berries, no berries, no berries, and then we get to a gap. So the machine has gone straight past, but just to prove the point, in that gap, it's full of rosehips just here. So that bit of hedge there would have had rosehips all over it, but as the machine's gone past, it's not cut the stuff in this little gap. Just proves the point about annual trimming. So these rosehips are going to be available for the birds to eat over the winter. The rest of the hedge, there's going to be nothing there at all. So trimming hedges with the flail machine needn't be the end of the world. It can be done really nicely and well, and actually sympathetically. And this hedge has been trimmed very lightly. Can you see? It's just like it's brushing along the edge of it. It's just coming out a little bit, incrementally increasing the volume of the hedge. It's not splattering anything. And actually by cutting incrementally, there are actually quite a few berries just on the tips. We have to put the hedge into a bracket of condition, given a set of criteria. And we're trying to find what is a good hedge. What makes a hedge in good condition? I happen to be standing by a hedge which I think really is in good condition at the moment. It's about 3 metres tall. It's got lots of different species. Just standing here I can see hawthorn, privet, wayfaring tree, there's some maple, there's some spindle. It's a rich hedge. It's alongside an old Chilterns footpath. It's not being trimmed every single year. It's solid all the way down to the base. There's a real shelter in there for nesting, for wildlife to travel up and down. It's a complete habitat. The fact that there's different species means that we will have flowering plants throughout the season. The blackthorn will be flowering first. Maybe if there's wild plum, that will be early. Then comes in May the hawthorn blossoms, and then on we go. The dogwood here is still flowering even now, actually. So there's a sort of food source throughout the winter at different times. That's absolutely ideal for wildlife. So this to me is a really, really good hedge. Hedges don't stay in this same condition always. They will change, they get older, the stems within get older, and that's why we have to rejuvenate a hedge periodically every 30 or 40 years. Either by cutting to ground level, which is called coppicing, and then up comes new growth and you start the life cycle again, or hedge laying. So this is hedge laying. This has been carried out in England for hundreds and hundreds of years. There's a long cut on an old piece of maple. I've cut diagonally through the stem, leaving just a small, maybe 1 centimetre at the hinge end, as we call it, and that's enough for the goodness to travel up through the stem. And every one of these has been cut in the same way. This is a Midland style hedge. There are about 20 different styles of hedges in the UK. But the thing that's common to all of them is this method of cutting and the fact that all this is alive. One of the great things about hedge laying is you come across nice surprises, and here's an oak tree, a lovely young oak tree. The whole hedge is about maybe 20, 25 years old. But I found a lovely oak tree, and this one's going to stay up there and grow on for future generations to enjoy. This is a hedge that I laid last year. As you can see, it's covered in new growth, so much so that I actually trimmed it a few days ago, and I trim it in a nice A shape. When you're trimming hedges, even with a big machine, it's nice to cut them in an A shape because it means the base is nice and wide and a lot of sort of shelter in the base. So you can see how solid this is. And it's worth remembering, I think, at this point, why hedges were ever planted in the first place. Sometimes they were planted to mark land ownership. You can't go along and move a boundary in the middle of the night if it's a planted hedge. But also they were planted to keep animals in or out of fields. There was no wire back in those medieval days at all. So they laid the hedge and formed a big, thick, stock-proof barrier. And this is a wonderful habitat for wildlife. So sometimes in even the best well-managed hedges, there's going to be gaps. And when we laid this hedge, we took the opportunity to plant up the gaps. There's yet another hedge I laid, but this one I laid 2 years ago, so it's had 2 years growth, and I've actually trimmed it lightly each year. And you can see now the berries are starting to form on that 2-year growth. Lots and lots of hawthorns on here, rosehips, etc. Great provision of food for overwintering birds, and a wonderful solid habitat that they can nest in and be protected. Hedgerow trees are another hugely important part of our landscape, and actually part of the whole hedgerow habitat, for want of a better word.
If you have just a hedge with some individual trees in it, it breaks up the hedge and provides a richer and more diverse habitat.
In the past, they were used as sight lines for ploughmen, as well as potentially boundary markers. Big oak here, probably 200 years old. The amount of life that contains within it, especially oak. A lot of species require oak, a lot of invertebrates require oak as part of their life cycle. They lay their eggs on the leaves and that kind of thing. Over 250 species rely on oak as part of its life cycle. That combination of a really well-managed hedge with a really good field margin next to it and hedgerow trees is like the epitome of good hedgerow management.
Once the survey has been carried out, the results will be analysed so that we will know where we have healthy hedgerows, where there are hedgerows that could be improved, and also how those hedgerows can be improved.
What we really want, I think, long term is we want our hedges healthy, we want them to be storing carbon for us all, we want them to be in a robust, good condition, because as climate changes, something that is robust and biodiverse is the strongest thing. And what I think we want in the long term is no net loss of hedges ever again in the parish of Watlington, and if we can plant some more and gain hedgerows, then that will be all for the better.
Sadly, many hedgerows have been lost over the years, and so they've become increasingly important. I would like to see a good network of well-connected, well-managed hedgerows with a good range of native species within those hedgerows.
So most of the residents of Watlington don't own land in that sense. They're not a big farmer or a landowner, but you can still do your bit, even in your back garden.
Planting trees in small gardens may not be appropriate, but planting a hedge can be.
Vitally important habitat in gardens are hedgerows, and you will get birds nesting in your hedgerow undoubtedly.
Wherever there's space, try and plant a hedge instead of putting up a fence.
Perhaps that hedgerow could link with neighbours' hedges or hedgerows in the neighbouring countryside. So we'd love to see more people planting hedgerows in their gardens. And please remember, you need to choose native hedgerow species.
And in terms of this project, as we finish the project and move forward, we hope we're going to be planting some hedges. Do volunteer to help us do that.
We would very much welcome more people getting involved with this project. There will be opportunities to get involved with the implementation stage, so please contact Watlington Climate Action Group.
Look at the hedgerows, understand what they give you, and let's help protect Watlington and its environment.
Right. I think everyone's coming back, having watched the film. I hope everyone enjoyed it and found it informative. Thanks again very much to Nicola for making the film, and to the Parish Council for their support, and for everyone involved, and particularly to Nigel. Now Nigel is with us this evening, and would welcome any questions about the film or about the Hedgerow project. Now I'm going to suggest, because we're on two screens, and so it's going to be hard for me to see who's asking questions, whether people could just jot a question down in the chat box, and I'll keep an eye on the chat box and then pass those questions on to Nigel. So if you've got a question, type it in there now, please, and then I will pass the question on to Nigel. I wonder whether, to kick off, Nigel, you could just update everybody on kind of where we've got to with the Hedgerow project and the survey.
Sorry, Nigel, just before, I just want to remind people, apparently about 15 people have said that they want to be in one of the specific discussion groups. If you could
Thank you.
Message Satnam if you've got a particular one that you think would be interesting for you. The choices again were wildlife gardening, community orchard, planning and development, and engagement and awareness. Those are the 4 topics. So if one of those appeals to you, then let Satnam know. Otherwise he will you'll be allocated randomly, I think.
Thanks, Nicola. Yes, thank you. I had realised we needed to do that, but then forgot. So to kick off with Nigel, I wondered whether you could just update everyone on where the Hedgerow project has got to.
Yeah, certainly, Fiona. Thank you very much indeed. I guess the truth is we took a bit of a break for Christmas and the New Year. And of course, also we've had this further lockdown. So we haven't done anything for a while. But when we formed the group, we initially had, as I think we said in the video, a couple of training sessions, which were great. And then we all got together on 2 Saturdays and did some serious work. But we all surveyed the same hedges so we could see if we were, balanced in our view of them, so to speak. And that worked out really well. And then we've separated in small groups. People can go out when they like, mostly Saturdays, some midweek sessions. And a couple of people go out at a time with permission of the landowner, and follow the People's Trust for Endangered Species survey routine. And everybody's been absolutely fantastic and got rather obsessed with hedges, some people, I think, and certainly enjoying it. So we're trundling along. As I say, there is a bit of a break at the moment for the Christmas and the lockdown. And also, I think people feel at the moment a little bit worried even about species identity. And of course, in the winter, you've got no leaves to play around with. So I think as we get into this new year now, we might have a session or 2 just to help people ID shrubs without leaves, because there are, signals that you can see on the leaf and the formation of the stem, etc. And so we hope to reboot soon and carry on. If I was to guesstimate how many we've done in the parish, possibly a 1/3, maybe something like that. We've some big tracts of land to do still, and we continue to get permission from landowners, but we've identified all the landowners in the parish, which is a great step forward. And on we go. And we hope to not only produce a final report with the state of our Watlington hedges, but as I mentioned in the film, if landowners do want a bit of advice, then we can certainly go and give them that. And looking forward, I hope that we can identify places to plant some hedges, and we can get the community involved in doing that planting.
Thank you, Nigel. That's great. Can I just add a quick thank you in here to Charlotte Moss again for her mapping, which has been hugely helpful with the Hedgerow project, identifying where all the hedgerows are.
Yeah.
Right, we have a few questions. The first one from Andrea Smith. Are there certain species of birds that are under threat that in Watlington could be encouraged or supported by the planting of specific hedgerow species?
I wouldn't say necessarily, Andrea, specific species. I think the planting of hedges is very important and the management of them. I think about 21 of the top priority farmland birds in the country are associated with hedgerows. Part of their life cycle, if you like, is dependent on hedgerows. And I'm particularly thinking around here, the yellowhammer, the bullfinch, there may even, for the bird watchers around here, I've never seen them, but I believe there are some corn buntings that pass through and loiter in our hedgerows. So certainly hedgerows are really crucial in the protection and livelihood of the birds, especially farm birds, which have decreased really drastically over the last 50 years and actually are still sort of decreasing even with all the agri-environment schemes that we have, which is a shame. So I wouldn't go so far as specific species. I think just hedgerows in good condition with a well-managed margin next to it and hedgerow trees is the perfect suite of habitats, if you like.
Thank you, Nigel. Right, we have another question here from Thomas Robinson. Hi, he says, of the 45 kilometres approximately of hedges in Watlington, how much was assessed to be in good bad condition? Well, we haven't quite got there yet because Nigel estimates we maybe have assessed a third. But do you have a sort of feeling about that, Nigel, and what the proportion might be?
We can refer back to the last countryside survey, and there used to be every 10 years a countryside survey which literally looks at everything in the countryside, measures its condition, as it were. Seemingly government budget doesn't allow for one in 2017, but the last one in 2007, countrywide in the UK, only 50% of hedgerows were in favourable condition. Worse news than that is in the arable farmed areas, only 12% of hedges were in favourable condition. And we have to say that we've two types of hedgerow in our parish. There's the uphill version, probably species rich, not so arable at the top of the hills, but down at the bottom, as soon as you hit the Watlington plain, it's mostly arable, really, to be fair. And we can see that a lot, even just driving around, especially the single species hawthorn hedges, which were planted in the Enclosure Acts in, what was it in Watlington, I don't know, 1860-ish or something like that. They're really looking bad. They have been trimmed at the same height for so long that, and I won't name names, but you can see them around, they're really in poor condition. So I would expect with the two type of hedges that we've got for the results to be similar-ish. And really we do have to improve that arable hedgerow statistic from 12%.
Thank you, Nigel. That's I can't believe how low that is. That's dreadful. A question from Keith Jackson. When replanting gaps in hedges, do we start with a base species such as hawthorn and add further species later, or wait for other species to appear naturally?
If I understand the question correctly, it's an interesting one in the sense that if we're gapping up a hawthorn hedge, a single Enclosure Act hawthorn hedge, do we put hawthorn in it or do we add species into it? I'm sort of split decision on that, really. I like the continuity, the sort of vernacular almost of planting hawthorn in there, but we know that for biodiversity, certainly different species, species-rich hedges are much more beneficial. So I think probably if I was to come down on one side, I think we need to introduce species because we need our hedges to be robust, even in terms of foreseeable climate change as well.
Thank you. I don't have any more questions up here at the moment. I just wondered whether any of our other sort of, any other people in the room, if you call it a room, I don't know, would like to contribute. Pardon?
Perhaps people could wave their hands. They might not feel confident.
Yeah, exactly. Oh, Valerie, please ask a question.
Yeah, I've just written one, but you obviously haven't got it. To Nigel, this is all very interesting about encouraging people to plant new hedges, but I'd like to know what, if anything, is being done to save and restore Watlington's ancient hedgerows that are gradually being destroyed by, I'm sorry to say, residents whose properties are adjacent to them. As a NIMBY, I have one in particular, Lower Purton Lane.
So these might be,
a very ancient and rich hedgerow with all kinds of genus in it and wildlife.
so I think are you referring to garden hedges in effect then?
No, this is an ancient hedgerow on the council boundary at the side of the road, not on the residence boundary.
I see. Yeah.
And I've lived here for what, a quarter of a century on this lane, and I've seen at least 4 gates being put in, which are illegal, and bits of it being chopped down. There's a couple of ancient hazels that every year I collect the nuts from that fall on the road. One has gone in this last year, I've noticed. Somebody's chopped it down.
That is sad indeed. It's a difficult question to answer specifically. There is a hedgerow protection bill that says if you want to remove a hedge, then you obviously have to ask permission, and you may or may not be granted that permission. I think it is about management really in the wider countryside. That's why I asked whether it was a more sort of town hedge really. Certainly in the countryside, we need to change people's views on the management of the hedge, and very often sometimes we have to be cruel to be kind with hedges. You know, they can get, not only are they over trimmed, I constantly go on about that, but the other extreme is when they're neglected completely and they get massively overgrown and nearly collapse. And sometimes we have to be cruel to be kind and rejuvenate them from the base, and that either involves hedge laying or dare I say even coppicing, which is cutting to ground level, and then they'll come up again. And so we have to do that. I guess the introduction of gates into hedgerows, I guess that is a planning issue, isn't it, really? If they're putting a gate onto a road, they have to apply for permission to make an entrance onto a road. But I do understand your concerns.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Would anyone else like to ask a question in relation to the hedgerow film or the hedgerow project? Or would any of our other experts, people from the Watlington Environment Group, Robert or Roselle, like to add anything to what's already been said about the project, or the questions that have been raised?
Not me, Fiona.
Oh, did I? I think I just saw a hand up there. David Parker, you need to unmute yourself.
Is anybody trying to assess where it would be beneficial to plant new hedges? I went out for a cycle ride through the Parker's estate today. There's some really huge fields, and it seems to me that one of the things that we should be trying to identify is potential sites for planting new hedgerows.
Yes, it is something that we sort of take in mind when we're going around. The limiting factor to that is, of course, we're suggesting that on somebody else's land. You know, that's the big thing. And of course, we know that with arable farmers, they tend to want larger fields rather than smaller fields, certainly. But we have talked about this, and one of the possibilities, I think, or some of the possibilities, are on the land that Watlington, in some way or other, a parish council or a trust or whatever own. There is some community land, shall I call it that, around down at the West Meadows and out on the charity land out towards Cooksum. So we're certainly looking at those with a view to planting, shall I call them, our own hedges. And then if we can influence and suggest help where grants can be got for other private landowners to plant hedges, some might say that the estate that you mentioned might be a bit loath to do anything like that, but I wouldn't have said that, of course. But so where we can, yes, we'd certainly want to plant hedges along with improving the management. Certainly, thanks for the question. Yeah.
A question from Nicola now for Nigel, which is what new incentives for government are coming in. And I was just thinking with your last question, when you were responding to the last question, of course, there will be with the Environment Bill, the ELMS scheme, Environmental Land Management Scheme, which will provide funding and incentives for farmers to manage their land in a better way for the environment. Perhaps you can add to that, Nigel.
Well, yes, and specifically, we've been a bit worried as the group steering group I sit on called HedgeLink, which is worth looking at their website. But we've been worried that they've never actually yet totally acknowledged that hedgerows will even be in it, because they're not acknowledging anything at the moment. But
oh, really?
I've been contributing to and listening in on the Oxford Real Farm Conference this week, which has been fantastic. And I think I can happily say that they certainly are going to recognise hedges and capital grants for hedge laying and coppicing and planting, and even different forms of management. And actually, the last 2 days, I've been really optimistic that hedgerows are going to come out of this very, very well, often being pushed along with the carbon story, you know, in terms of, you know, and the estimate, and I knew this anyway, that they want, you know, an extra 200,000 kilometres of hedgerow planted, you know, in the next 20 or so years throughout the nation. So it's really optimistic, I think, now. I was dubious at first, but quite happy.
Well, that sounds very encouraging, because, you know, as you say, you know, there are many landowners who just, you know, unless there's an incentive for them to do it, they're not going to do it.
Yes. Well, and as you know, the grant system is going to change with the whole ELM thing, and farmers are going to get, landowners are going to get paid for providing public goods, which is an interesting concept, isn't it?
It is indeed. Right. Well, I think we'll move on in a minute, but we might have time for another question if there are any. I'll just flick across the screen and see if there's any hands waving. I don't think so. Okay. Thank you very much, Nigel. That was very helpful, and thanks again for the film, which was enjoyable.
Well, thank Nicola, because it was great, wasn't it?
Yeah, absolutely. And please, everybody, spread the word about the film, share it with everyone, with people that you know who might be interested. We want to get it out there and use it to continue to raise awareness about this project and hedgerows in general. The next bit of the evening is that we're going to split into these groups. I trust that people who would like to join a discussion group have signed up for one. I gather that the wildlife gardening one is particularly popular, Ian, and is full. So there's obviously a lot of interest in that, which is great. These are very informal, these groups. We'll discuss the subjects for about 10 minutes or so. For some of us, for example, myself and Andrea, we may not be experts at all in the area that we're talking about, but it's just really, we are just facilitating a discussion group, and want to know whether, whether you've got ideas, whether you'd like to input, whether you'd like to volunteer, whether you've got suggestions for how we might encourage other people to volunteer. Any ideas would be welcome. So we'll break into the groups, which Satnam will do in a minute, for 10 minutes. And then if each group could nominate somebody to make notes and then report back. When we all come back together, we can just briefly report back, and then we'll bring the evening to a close.
Okay, I think we're good. Okay.
So now, by the wonders of technology, hopefully this will work. You'll all be put into your groups.
Everybody hold tight.
And then I think we get a warning when we've got a minute to go. Is that right, Satnam?
Yeah, I'll convene with Nicola on our little WhatsApp chat and then send out a message with a 1 minute warning.
Okay, that's perfect.
Thanks.
What's that?
That was brilliant timing. Andrea was just asking for volunteers and it went.
Yeah, sorry guys. Once I tell it to close the rooms, it's on a timer and I can't stop it.
Brilliant organisation, Satnam.
Yeah, Satnam, thank you. That was absolutely brilliant. But it never, even though there was a warning, we still weren't prepared for it. But it worked really well. So I think if we can all feed back, if I start off with our group, I've really valued everyone's input. Thank you so much. And everyone is keen that there is a community orchard in Watlington, but we kind of landed up looking at it in a slightly different way than I think we have been looking at it, by somebody suggesting, well, you know, are we talking about one site, or could we have sort of individual trees on different sites around the town rather than having one site as a community orchard? So, you know, for example, we could have, you know, a couple of trees in Mola Gardens, a few trees around the edge of the recreation ground. I think that's such a great idea. Terry?
That's one reason I wanted to be in I wanted to be in all the groups. The orchard groups, the orchard ideas. I've been trying to find somewhere to have an orchard for ever since I've started Watlington in Bloom. So about 2010. It's been really difficult to find a site, but when we've been talking to developers, we've actually theoretically arranged for there to be an orchard site and an allotment site adjacent to site B, or part of site B.
Yes, I was aware of that, Terry, and I did inform the group of that.
Yeah, and we've also suggested that in site A that there's a lot of trees, street trees being planted, and we've asked that a lot of them be fruit or nut trees.
Yeah, that's great. And that's very much, you know, what we were saying, that, you know, that if we can encourage where trees are being planted, that they're fruit trees. But I think, you know, the idea was we're aware that on site B, there could be a site designated for an orchard, which is great. But in the meantime, perhaps we could move on with planting, you know, just small numbers of trees, or even individual trees, fruit trees. So I thought that was a great idea. The other thing that came up was that we should make more of the fact that, you know, obviously a lot of people have trees within their own gardens and maybe don't know how to prune them properly. And so it was suggested that we could try and organise a pruning course for individuals to look after their own fruit trees better. And I thought that was a great idea. If we can see if we can get somebody to come to Watlington and run a course. So we will explore that. So I think those were the main ideas. Oh, and the other one that was raised was the possibility of more fruit trees being planted on the allotments, and apparently there's in Henley, on some of the allotments there is a sort of community garden where fruit trees are being planted, so that might be something else we could explore as well. So I think those were the main points from our group. Can I hand over to Ian?
You can indeed. And just in answer to that point you just made there, Fiona, about getting somebody to come in and advise on cutting trees, I did go on a half-day course as a birthday present about 15 years ago to a local orchard where they trained you for half the morning and then they let you loose on their trees with a saw in your hand and just said, go ahead and do what I've just taught you. And that was extremely good, so that it should be possible to get somebody to come and do that. Right, on the wildlife gardening, thanks everybody who joined in that group. We discussed the articles which we've been writing. These articles are seen as a quick win. Just after the first meeting that was held at the town hall, when we met again online, we thought that putting some articles out about wildlife gardening was a way we could get something going almost immediately, pending the start of the Hedgerows project, etc. And I work on the theory that there's a marketing theory that people need to see something about 7 times before they get it in their mind. So we're up to about 6 articles, 6 months worth. We need another couple, and hopefully people have got the idea. Part of the feedback was, can we put them together in one place, perhaps on the Watlington Climate Action Group website or the Facebook, where people can get access to all of the articles, and perhaps we can just build that up into a single resource. Because part of it is all about signposting people in the right direction, because every single major organization out there that's involved in some way with gardens has got wildlife pages, and any animal you're interested in, you can find information about it. So, of course, what then happens, we couldn't actually organize any kind of events since we started doing this. And looking to the future, one possibility is as and when next there is a Watlington Open Gardens, is the possibility of highlighting wildlife friendly aspects of people's gardens. So you can go around and look at that. Another idea here is with the new developments, we're going to have several hundred new families moving into Watlington, and wouldn't it be a good idea if they got some kind of welcome package which reminded them of the fact that their developer has put up Swift boxes, has made provision for wildlife corridors, that they should be leaving the gap through to the next garden for the hedgehogs. And out of that is possibly then, could there be an advisory service? It would require volunteers and enthusiasts who would be prepared to provide advice, volunteer or even professional advice to people who want to know how to design or develop their gardens. And just another little thing we're planning to do just to further encourage people is my daughter Eliza and I built a model of a wildlife garden, and when the weather warms up a bit, we'll get it put in one of the windows down the high street at children's eye level, where they'll be able to see everything labelled up that you can do in your garden for wildlife. Then what about, we all know about Movember and dry Januaries. What about a month when people are encouraged to leave a couple of square meters of their lawn uncut to see what grows? Robert's going to be writing about that because he's a bit of an expert on it, but we could have a let your grass grow in a patch. And then what you have is what's called a bee lawn. You get the little flowers coming up and you can see what happens. You can do what my parents have done, which has left a huge area where they have anthills which are nearly 1 meter tall, where they are on the North Downs. But we're not suggesting we do that. And finally, asking people who've done something with wildlife to submit photographs, which could then be put onto the various web pages or even put into Watlington Times as practical examples of things that people have done. And I may well make a start on that by getting some pictures of ponds in people's gardens for a future article. So there we are. That's a summary of some ideas that we came up with just now.
Great ideas, Ian. Really good.
That's great. Thank you very much. Okay, so could we next go to Andrea? Sorry, I assumed that Ian was speaking for his group, and of course I had said to someone to report back if you can.
They chose me.
Yeah, they chose you. I just did it. I didn't even give them an opportunity to choose. Andrea.
I didn't actually ask either. I was kind of cut off in mid-sentence. I didn't quite get there. But anyway, I think essentially what we really did was look at the development plans for the site that's already being developed and looked at Site A, I think it's referred to as Red Kite View. And just really looked at that and how and what we've been doing as volunteers to try and work with the psychologist and how we're planning to try and have a meeting on site. We would have had a meeting on site on Monday, but the lockdown stopped that. But we're still hoping, if restrictions allow, that maybe there could be a one person meeting with the ecologist to look around and see what is on the site that's going to be protected and kept during the development, so we could see what it looks like in reality and not just on a map. But the idea is to really try and build up a sort of a volunteer workforce who would be willing to kind of be involved to help monitor these new developments as they start, you know, because we've got 2 more sites that will be due to start in the next 6 months to a year, perhaps. And I think it's very important that we keep a close eye on those and on the green assets on those sites, and to be sure that they don't get damaged during the works, and that they do what they say they're going to do. But I just got to the point of asking if there were any volunteers, and we came back into the main room. So. But we have 1 more volunteer who wants to come onto the group. So is there anything else you can think of that we discussed? We thought also it'd be nice to try and have a chat with you, Ian, about the watercourses, because there is a wildlife site on there that's going to be built, and an attenuation basin and some wetland areas. And of course the site runs alongside Chalk Stream. And we wondered if you might like to cast your eye on that diagram and see if there's something more that could be done to promote the wetland area there.
Yes, it's worth pointing out as well that we've got Mike Chadwick from the Watlington Environment Group, who's been very heavily involved in the planning side there, and he's been looking at this as well. So we do want to take an interest in what they're planning to do with this retention basin. One of the problems with them is that they do dry out. They're intended to only fill when it rains, unless they've got a provision for water to be in there. But unfortunately, there's a lot of health and safety issues with them. Because they're owned by somebody, they've got water, there are small children, risk of drowning. In fact, in Scotland, if you build them, you have to put a high fence around them, and you're not allowed to put anybody on them.
Ian, if I may butt in, Andrea, do you mind?
No, not at all.
Ian, we were particularly talking not about the attenuation basin, but what was the watercress beds.
Right.
I recall as a kid it obviously stopped being watercress beds, but it was a reed bed, essentially. We've talked about this before, perhaps, but I'm just tiny bit worried that we're missing a super duper opportunity to in some way play around with the hydrology of what's going on there and try and get some wetter areas rather than it just be a concrete path around the outside of a sort of kick around football area.
Yeah.
Just a bit worried that we're missing an opportunity in there, and I'd love to talk to you about that. Is a really wet area and was historically watercress beds once.
Well, I'll tell you what we need to do then, Nigel, is we need to get together with Mike Chadwick, who leads the Watercourses project, and the three of us have a conversation about it, because it would be well worth doing that.
Yeah, sure.
That would be great. That would be really helpful.
Could I just butt in there also, because many won't be aware that we did put together a document which you kindly edited about exactly that area that went to SODC, didn't it? For the because of to the planning department.
The one about the hedge.
Well, yeah, but we covered the
it was largely about the hedge, wasn't it? So I don't think it went into sufficient detail on the wetland, this potential for more wetland areas.
Yeah, I think the other thing that came up when we had our talk with the ecology officer for Bloor Homes is that the hedgerow that we thought we'd saved possibly has just had a temporary reprieve. So we've asked her if she could try and make it less temporary.
Yeah.
And also if a group do get together to talk about the drainage and reinstating the lack of drainage, if you like, then we need to relay that to Louise, the ecology officer, and you can do that through me if you want.
Great.
That would be great if you could follow up on that, Ian and Nigel and Mike.
Okay.
And happy to be involved as well, as I was in the meeting with the ecologist the other day.
Let's do that.
Yeah.
Mike Chadwick, I know, has met with the ecologist previously, if it was the same one, to tell him that there were trout in the brook, which he had no idea about, and they got quite excited about that.
It's not the same one because it's the ecologist is female.
Right. Okay. Different guy.
I'm happy to be involved in any future meetings as well, Ian or Nigel. Okay. Yeah.
That's great. I mean, one of the concerns as well with all of this is that you know, where there are proposals for planting trees, creating grasslands, wetlands, etc., we have to be sure that the right setup is in place to manage these, you know, properly into the future, and that's so important. And that is something that is there is still no clarity about that. There will be some funds for it. Okay, well, that's been really helpful. I think we better move on because we're meant to be finishing at 9:30, and I thought it would be good to finish with Nicola's group.
Hi.
And so if you can report back, that would be great.
Okay, so the first thing that we discussed in our group was that half the group hadn't seen the film. And I was just wondering whether anybody else had had that problem of not being able to.
Oh
no. So if anyone wasn't able to access the link or couldn't find the link, or also equally for people who perhaps were late, this whole session is being recorded, so that will eventually go onto our website. But if you contact me through the Watlington Climate Action Group website on the contact form and let me know if you weren't able to see the film, then I'll make sure that you get a copy of the link so that you can watch it. And likewise for the if you were late and would like to see the presentation at the beginning.
Will there be a link to the website on the a link to the film on the website?
Yes, there also will be. Yes, it will go on the website as well. Yeah, that's true. It will be on the homepage. So what we discussed, well, I made a few haphazard notes as I was going along, but I've really scribbled. You'll remember, hopefully most people will have seen the community art trail that Art Weeks ran this summer, which was absolutely brilliant. Well, we discussed having a version of that, because that last summer that was focused on the plastic waste, the issue of plastic waste. We thought it'd be really great if we could have a green plan version of that art trail. So artworks relating to the different projects around Watlington, summer workshops with kids, if we're able to do that, and do something around the August bank holiday. There was a suggestion that the map that Charlotte has done could be recreated using plastic bottle tops to create a big life-size map of where the hedges are in Watlington, perhaps with different colours representing different sorts of hedges or things like that. That perhaps that could go, or there's also the opportunity to put something like that on the Methodist railings or the town hall or the paddock. We also found out that the people who own the fencing bounding the Methodist chapel are artists as well, and might well be interested in getting involved with putting some art on, green plan art related to that. We also talked about Jules's project. She's creating lots of hedgerow inks, inks made out of hedgerow trees. And Sylvia also suggested doing some tie-dyeing projects using those inks to create things. Yes, Joan.
Yes, sorry.
I probably didn't explain that very well.
Well, I just wanted to interject quickly to explain why the Methodist chapel is relevant. That's because the Methodists have agreed to allow the establishment of an arts hub in the old preschool building. Andrea, Jules, a couple of others who aren't here are core to that. And so if we can create, and the idea of the Arts Hub is permanent studio space, but also workshop space for families, for kids. So if we can create something using the garden that might be a living set of workshops promoting ideas in the green plan, that would be great.
And also
the garden at the Methodist chapel is fantastic.
That's great.
Also an exhibition space, Jane, wasn't it? At the
yes,
back there? Yeah.
Yes, sorry, that too, exactly.
I'm trying to, was there anything else that I may have missed?
That maybe filming, screening the Hedgerow films maybe in the chapel at the same time.
Oh yeah.
Oh yeah, good idea.
You were talking about your articles, weren't you, Nicola, about what's in a hedge and a poem and things like that?
Yeah, they're all films.
Films, yeah.
They're all little films. So there's 4 Hedgerow films. 2 have now been published. So there was one that I did as a sort of teaser, which was What's in a Hedge. There's the one that most people have seen today, which is more like a straight documentary. And then I've done a sort of more artistic little film about hedges. And then I'm going to do one how to lay a hedge, which is the footage I've got of Nigel actually showing how to lay a hedge, which is fascinating. So there's that I still need to put together.
Because we were talking about having that on a running basis, weren't we, on the August bank holiday thing?
That's what Jules was just saying. We just need to get the Methodists on board, so that's that action point for us. But they've been incredibly supportive so far, so I guess they will be.
Yeah. So that was that from me. Shall I share my screen, Fiona, so that Andrea can?
Yes, please. Perfect. Thank you very much.
Okay, Andrea. Have we still got Andrea?
Sorry, 1 second. It's just when you shared your screen, my screen with the mute button vanished somewhere. So
oh.
Okay. Well, basically, next week is a talk from really quite a major guy in his field. He's the brother of a friend of mine, and he's become a key consultant in the field of offshore wind. And he's actually managed to advise over 29 countries around the world on offshore wind. His name is Alistair Dutton. I've got 2 links that I was going to share in the chat box from some things that he sent, which are some pre-readings. People can actually read up on his work and about offshore wind before next week's meeting. But basically, while he is going to talk about the technology as a whole, what he is hopefully going to do is talk to us about how it can benefit us locally in Watlington. And how environmentally friendly it is, and how efficient it is. So I think it's going to be a really fascinating talk, and you should be able to answer a lot of our questions about that. I think we'll probably, if people do want to do some pre-reading and have some questions they want to ask him, they can send them to me in advance, or you can just ask them in the chat on the night. I think that's as much as I can think about. Shall I share the links to those pre-readings in the chat now, do you think, Nicola?
Yes, or we can just send those in an email to people who've registered, because as Satnam's just let me know. Satnam, we can also send a link to the film and the presentation as well from tonight.
I could also very quickly share a screen that just shows a little introduction about him.
Okay. So I need to stop sharing.
Okay.
While Andrea's doing that, we've got lots of other events coming up, so please do check out the events page on our website and register. I know that some people have already seen some of those. But yeah, that we've got the wind event, and then in February we've got an event on green investing, which should be really interesting as well. So keep an eye on that for more events. Lots of wide variety of different subjects.
There, right. So that is Alistair Dutton there. Can you see that?
Yep.
Yeah. Chair of the Global Offshore Wind Task Force. He's been involved in the offshore wind industry for 20 years.
Nothing.
And so he's been involved. He's now a consultant in his own right, but he has been with various companies for many years. There's also more information. Yeah, so in the last 3 years, he's advised 29 countries. He's recognized as an expert for International Energy Agency, International Renewable Energy Agency, UK government, and the Global Wind Energy Council and World Bank. So he definitely knows his stuff, and I think and he's an all-round good egg. So he's really interesting to listen to, I think.
I think it's going to be a really interesting evening. Thanks very much. It's quite a coup to have got Alistair to agree to do that. So yeah, we'll look forward to that.
Yes, thanks very much. It sounds excellent. Sadly, I won't be able to join as I'm already on another Zoom event next week, but I hope it goes well. And I just want to thank everyone for joining us this evening. It's been great to have so many people here, and thank you for your ideas as well, which has been really, really helpful. If anyone wishes to get more involved and volunteer with us, please let us know. And do please continue to make suggestions as well, as that would be really helpful. And yeah, please share the Hedgerow film. So Nicola, did you want to add anything before we finish?
No, thank you very much for coming, everyone, and yeah, we'll be in touch. Let's keep this project going.
Yeah.
Thank
Thanks very
you.
much then. Bye.
very much.
Bye.
Brilliant.
Take care.
Bye.
Bye.